They were born at the edge of a frozen river, in a year that felt colder than its calendar. The midwife wrote a line and then folded the ledger over. Neighbors closed shutters and pretended not to remember. But the pond beneath Cedar Hollow kept its reflections. And sometimes the past's ripple returns. 3 babies, a single birth, 3 mouths, 3 hands. They grew in a town that spoke pity in one breath and suspicion in another. The medical men could not make sense of them. The minister could not baptize their silence. And a quiet family secret, first whispered, then denied, would grow teeth. If you want a simple answer, there is none. This is a story where grief, belief, and a very old kind of fear converge. This is the Cedar Hollow Triplets. Cedar Hollow sat in a fold of Ohio that the maps called ordinary. Farmland. A mill framed by willows. A wooden bridge that groaned in winter. In 1856, it was a place where most people had family who had been there for 3 generations, where news arrived by wagon and rumor by hearthside. The economy here was small and brittle. Seasonal harvests. A miller who counted in bushels. A church with a bell that tolled for weddings and funerals alike. Society organized itself into visible roles. Husband, midwife, minister, doctor. But there were also the quieter roles. The neighbor who took late shifts at the mill. The woman who watched the children. The people who kept secrets so that the village could keep its peace. When something happens among those quieter roles, it is hard at first to name it, and harder still to stop it from growing. The winter midwife, a woman named Ruth Hale in most accounts, recorded details that would later be argued over. A single labor that lasted the better part of a day. 3 infants, all alive and all small, as if the same wick had been split into 3 flames. The town watched and called sermons and prayers. Some families brought warm blankets, others a dish. The midwife wrote in a ledger, then hesitated over the names, as if ink could not hold the shape of what had happened. How do you name 3 lives born in a single breath? In a small town, names matter because they hold story and claim. The family and the Fletchers named them Elijah, Amos, and Jude in one informal record handed down. In the weeks that followed, neighbors observed the obvious and the uncanny. The babies were fragile. They seemed to sleep best when together, and they emitted a hush, a stillness, that made some visitors uneasy. At first, the oddities were small and private. The triplets, if you could call them separate, would quiet when placed together. When separated, one baby would wail and another's pulse thinned. The physician called it abnormal, but not impossible. A neighboring midwife said she'd seen strange sibling symmetries before, but the measure that pulled the town's attention was more subtle. The boys seemed to respond to the same stimulus at the same moment. A distant bell. A woman's hymn. The doctor took notes, heart rates, feeding charts, stool records. The scientific act in a small town is meticulous but bounded. A notebook. A thermometer. A patient story. The notebook showed nothing conclusive. What those pages would not capture were the small, stubborn things. A lullaby that could stop a cough. An ember of calm that seemed to pass between them like a current. Communities read signs through lenses they already carry. To some, the triplets were a blessing or a curiosity. To others, a bad omen. The minister's sermon softened the language to meekness. God works in strange measures. But word travels faster than comfort. Gossip grew, and with gossip came division. Some mothers refused to let their children play near the Fletcher yard. A couple of merchants whose families had once been friends began to avoid eye contact. The moral calculus of small towns is unforgiving. If you don't belong to the ordinary pattern, you become a place to throw anxieties at. Local science and the physician's careful notes and the midwife's ledger had offered no comfort. When reason fails, people's instinct turns toward stories, and stories sometimes breed fear. Lover months. Other incidents began to fold into the Mitchell ledger. A horse refused to cross near the river where the family walked. A dog would not enter the Fletcher's yard. A woman said she'd felt cold like a hand in midsummer when she stood near the boys. Small things easily dismissed, except that the small things multiplied. A washer found a child's toy placed outside the house exactly at midnight. A bell that used to toll on Sundays faltered once and then resumed. Patterns can be coincidence, but patterns also gather a weight that forces attention. The town council discussed sending a learned man from Columbus, though travel was slow and reputations travel even slower. When a doctor finally came, he recorded the clinical details and then he recorded his own unease in private. Dr. Halverson, who rode across 2 counties, came with lantern, case and an earnest need for order. He examined heartbeats, lungs, digestive function. He wrote in a shorthand that still survives in transcribed notes. Occasional bradycardia when separated, synchronous breathing in proximity, an odd drop in temperature if only one was warmed. He performed tests with the crude tools of the day, rubbing warmth, making cloths of different thicknesses, noting time and reaction. His conclusion: unexplained symbiosis in the trio. Further observation recommended. In a larger city, such notes get reviewed by peers. Here they circulated in whisper and eventually became the seed of a rumor. Either the boys were a miraculous anomaly, or something else was afoot. One night at the mill, a boy named Thomas, no relation, fell through the ice and the town rushed to the riverbank. The triplets' house had lights in the yards. People called. Someone waded in to pull Thomas out, and the three babies were placed against each other to keep warm. Thomas survived. The miller later said that forces move in small towns. When an emergency happens, everyone lends a hand. Yet afterward the talk shifted. Why had the boys' presence felt like a tether, a source of steady warmth in the cold? People began to attribute practical miracles to the triplets. Small rescues, sudden comfort, inexplicable healing of bruises. These stories were soft and dangerous. Soft because they soothed. Dangerous because they raised expectations. The human mind is hungry for causality. When comfort and unease mingle, some seek blame. A neighbor's cow died suddenly. A housekeeper found her crops blighted. A scrawled rumor accused the triplets of stealing warmth, of stealing life. Accusation is a corrosive force. It spreads like mold in the damp places of a town. The Fletchers were asked to explain the inexplicable, and they answered with honesty. They did not know more than anyone else. But confession in a town is not always forgiveness. Meetings were held in the church basement. The minister tried to reason, and the older women washed their hands at the sink with a fierceness that felt like ritual cleansing. The lines in the ledger of community trust were fraying. One morning, Amos was not where he should have been. The day began with chores and then the sound of a mother's call that went unanswered. Searchers combed hedgerows, the mill paths, barns. By sundown, a small shoe was found near the willow bridge and then nothing more. The town grieved a disappearance with the same ritual used for loss. Prayer. Search again. Some insisted the boy had wandered. Others whispered that the land had taken him. The midwife's ledger recorded the anxiety with blunt ink. In a settlement where a child could stray and be lost to the underbrush, the disappearance might have been tragic and nothing more. But the context of the triplets' fragile dependency made people read the absence as part of a larger grammar of meaning. 3 days after Amos vanished, he returned, not from a town search but from a place people preferred to forget. A shallow patch at the edge of the mill pond where icy reeds knuckled into the bank. He was cold, eyes wild, and when neighbors drew him near the other two triplets, a hush descended. No one could explain where he'd been. The doctor found no evidence of injury and no indication of violence. The child's memory was fogged when questioned. He pointed to nothing and then to everything. This return alleviated some worry but deepened other fears. What had he seen? What had changed in him? In small towns, mystery that returns unaccounted for becomes myth-making fuel. When unexplainable events nest in a small community, theories multiply to fill the empty places. The physician suggested physiological dependency and rare genetic anomaly. The minister suggested a spiritual test, and the older women offered charms and prayers. Stories from older settlers, some who came from Appalachia or from across the sea, slipped into the discourse. Tales of children bound by a curse, of souls who shared a tether. Each theory did two things. It tried to make sense and it rearranged responsibility. Science asked for controlled observation. The church asked for confession and penance. Folklore asked for stories. None contained the whole truth, but each shaped how people acted. Months later, a second boy, Jude, was absent for a night. Searchers called at dawn, and again the town bent itself into the urgent pattern of recovery. This time the search turned up an odd symbol scratched into a barn post. 3 small marks like a tally, but not quite. People saw meaning in it, a message, a sign of a watcher, or simply childish play. Families packed sacks and some left town for a week, frightened by the cruel uncertainty. The persistence of events began to shape a new rhythm. Watchfulness at dusk, ropes on doors, and a strange etiquette about leaving lanterns burning all night for the boys. The community's sleep, once unbroken, thinned into vigilant watch. At length, a scholar from the State College, Dr. Wainwright, arrived with a skeptical air and a mind trained in the new sciences, physiology, contagion, and the early maps of neurology. He performed measured tests, asked pointed questions, looked for environmental causes, contaminants, waterborne toxins, even parasites. His test returned nothing conclusive. He wrote a paper that never quite left his desk, because publishing a definitive finding required evidence that Cedar Hollow did not have. He left with a note that read, "Unusually synchronous physiological responses among siblings. Mechanism unknown. Recommend long observation." His leaving felt like both a rebuke and a relief. The town had asked science for an answer, and science had offered only another kind of unease. Stories suggest a night when people could not stay apart from what frightened them. For reasons small and human, a barn dance, a death, a comfort. The town gathered near the old willow where children had once played. Some accounts say they meant to pray, others say they meant to confront. The boys were present, wrapped and subdued under watch. In the gentle press of people, an argument flared and then grew like a match. A voice shouted, a lantern passed hands, a scuffle was heard across the square. By morning, an old woman had collapsed in the square and the minister sat with his head in his hands. Those who remembered later described a new threshold. The town had crossed it when ordinary sorrow met a persistent supernatural question. The last night is the one that no ledger could make sense of. One winter's dusk, heavy, with the kind of sky that presses, the third boy, Elijah, vanished. People searched until the river's edge, through each shed and barn, and then to the edge of the woods where old stones mark graves. The silence that followed was the worst kind. A silence that insisted something had been taken from the fabric of town life. Some said they saw a figure on the bridge. Others swore they heard 3 children laughing in a place that had no right for laughter. The Fletchers were left in a grief that the town could not touch with its rituals. Where documentation existed, it recorded only a search and the sound of a town that had lost its hope. Time moves in 2 ways, the clock that counts days and the memory that reshapes them. Within a generation, the story of the triplets had been folded into campfire tales. In some accounts, they became guardian spirits. In others, they became an omen to frighten children into obedience. The things we cannot scientifically solve often fall into folklore because stories can hold more than facts. They carry warning, identity, and the emotional accounting that official papers sometimes refuse. Cedar Hollow's children learned a lullaby with a hidden refrain about 3 small lights that go out when greed opens its hands. The lullaby is the town's survival, to keep meaning where record kept nothing. Time moves in 2 ways, the clock that counts days and the memory that reshapes them. Within a generation, the story of the triplets had been folded into campfire tales. In some accounts, they became guardian spirits. In others, they became an omen to frighten children into obedience. The things we cannot scientifically solve often fall into folklore because stories can hold more than facts. They carry warning, identity, and the emotional accounting that official papers sometimes refuse. Cedar Hollow's children learned a lullaby with a hidden refrain about 3 small lights that go out when greed opens its hands. The lullaby is the town's survival, to keep meaning where record kept nothing. Modern science has more tools, but not always more answers where culture and memory intertwine. Today we have genetic tests, epidemiology, and social psychology, and still there are edge cases where cause resists detection. The Cedar Hollow case sits at that edge. Physiological oddities, social stressors, climate variations, and the human propensity to fill the unknown with story. Our job now is not to prefer myth over method or method over memory, but to use both rigor and empathy when examining lives that were rendered strange by circumstance. When we do, we honor the people who lived them. What do we take from Cedar Hollow? Maybe nothing tidy, but perhaps something honest, that the line between wonder and fear is thin, and we should use care when we walk it. The triplets' story ends neither as miracle nor as horror, but as memory of a town trying to make sense of a puzzle with the tools it had. Faith, science, gossip, and care. If this story unsettles you, let that feeling be useful. Ask questions, look for records, and when possible, treat the traces of other people's lives with humility. If you want the archive list or the midwife's ledger transcription, ask in the comments and we will publish it. Subscribe for more responsibly told historical mysteries. Remember the names Elijah, Amos, Jude, as more than a headline, as people who once filled small hands and warmed small beds.